see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right.
Yes.
Very good. So this is a building that might be familiar to many of you. So what is this building? Can you recognize this building?
Gateway of India.
That's right. I want to open the chat window. How do I do it? So, how do I open the chat? I don't know how to open the chat. Just hold on. Okay, got the chat window going. All right, very good. Excellent. So this is the gateway of India. Okay, when was it built? Anybody know when it was built? Just type in if you know the answer. When was it built? Don't know. Okay. So this was built in around 1915 to 1920, or 1922, 23, thereabouts. Okay. This was a building. This was a classic colonial era building, which was built in honor of the King George V, who came to India. And it's an iconic structure in Mumbai. These components for a long time now, for many years now, and I think the time has come for a new Ram Mandir in Ayodhya, given the verdict this morning. How many of you have heard of the Supreme Court verdict that came out this morning? Just say yes if you already heard about it. Yeah. Now, the contrast is as follows, right? The previous slide showed you a colonial era building, and we might say this Ram Mandir, which is going to come up in India, is a post-colonial building. Okay, it's a new structure imagined in a post-colonial Hindu India. So that's my lead into the topic. Now, what are we going to talk about today? Okay, so we're going to take up a few questions. Colonialism and its aftermath. The colonial construction of knowledge of Hinduism. Post-colonialism as a field of study. Application of post-colonial theory in Hindu studies. And prospects, opportunities, and possibilities. Okay, so this is sort of the structure of this discussion. And I want to invite Kundan Singh, Dr. Kundan Singh, who's on the webinar as well, to briefly introduce himself before we move forward. Okay, over to you, Kundan.
Thank you, Kalyan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm a core faculty at the Hindu University of America. Earlier, I was a core faculty at Sophia University, which is located in Palo Alto, California. I was teaching in the department of transpersonal psychology in the doctoral program. I taught there for about 10 years. And just to give you a brief overview of transpersonal psychology. Transpersonal psychology is a reformatted name of spiritual psychology. And we can safely say that this psychology has come from the worldview, which is contained in Hinduism and Buddhism. So in a certain sense, you can say it's a colonial or a Western name, for Hindu Buddhist psychology. it's basically this field, post-colonial Hindu studies, and the possibilities that I see through this field that I actually got attracted towards Hindu University of America. I will be talking about all those in great detail. Before becoming a faculty at Sophia University, I began teaching at the California Institute of Integral Studies, from where I have done my doctorate. My doctorate is in disciplinary humanities with a concentration in East-West psychology. And my dissertation was on Sri Aurobindo, Sri Ramakrishna, and Swami Vivekananda, where I was basically looking at the evolution of integral yoga through Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. Many of you would know that the brand of yoga that Sri Aurobindo spoke about is called integral yoga. Before that, I was in India. I did my master's in applied psychology from Delhi University. And before that, I did my undergraduate studies in chemistry from University of Delhi. So that's my brief introduction. And we can continue the proceedings further, Kalyan.
Okay, very good. Great. Thank you, Kundar. So in the next slide, I'm going to take you through a very simple representation of the burden of and when I say our, the Hindus, people's colonial history. And this chart is a representation of the share of world GDP of three countries, India, USA, and UK. And this data has been assembled from the statistics put together by Professor Angus Madison, and I'll show you a little bit more about him in the next slide. But as you can see, the India's share of world GDP was nearly 35%, 33%, around 0C, as per the reconstruction of Angus Madison. And it collapsed, it dramatically collapsed under colonial rule. And there were two events that are significant in this trajectory. The first is the beginning of Islamic invasions, which resulted in its own kind of imperialism, colonialism on India. And then there was, of course, the onslaught of British, which I'm calling Christian colonization here, which further declined India very, very rapidly. And most of us were born here, and one of the consequences of being born here is that it is very hard for all of us to imagine what India was like and how Hinduism was in prior terms when the Hindu people were a prosperous people. Were a prosperous civilization. In fact, one of the very common myths that our contemporary academia has tried hard to instill in most Hindus is that Hinduism or Hindu people, Hindu civilization, has always been very poor, has always been very, very backward, and so on. So now I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, okay? So the first question is, how much money did England / Europe extract from India in 200 years, over a 200-year period? Just type it in, okay? It's an estimate. I'm asking for an estimate. Just type in an estimate. If somebody knows the answer exactly, please don't respond. I'm asking for people who don't know to provide an estimate. Anybody willing to offer an estimate? Okay, nobody? Okay, so do you, obviously, you know, we don't know exactly how much money England extracted from India, right? Because if we knew it, we would be answering this question. $2.5 trillion, Poonam Gupta says. Okay, wonderful. Thank you for the estimate. Anybody, any other counter estimates from anybody? Now, the extraction of wealth from India took place over 200 years approximately. Okay, nearly 200 years. Okay, Maya Ram says 3,000 plus temples destroyed by Islamic invaders. Now, that number 3,000 is a very, very rough guess. Okay, I'll come to that number in a minute. Mukesh says 7.5 trillion. Okay, it's actually more than that. Okay, so let me give you the answer. The current day estimates, contemporary estimates, are coming up with the figure $45 trillion. Okay, $45 trillion. So the next question, how many temples were destroyed by Islamic invaders during the period of invasions? So there is one estimate, 3,000 on the table. Do we have any other estimates for that? 500,000 plus. Okay, that's a very high number. Now, you know, one interesting thing is, you know, very few systematic studies have been done on these topics, you know, and there are estimates ranging from a few thousand to 45,000, 50,000, etc. And I think that it's an excellent topic for research to advance a proper estimate on how many temples were destroyed. But let's move on. Now, the same chart again, a different message. There were the great universities of the past, Takshashila, Nalanda, and Alexandria in Africa, Northern Africa. And then slowly as time passed, the great universities of the world became Oxford and Cambridge. Maya Ram says, reading Sitaram Goel. Yeah, Sitaram Goel, his estimate is a start on this topic. Okay, so he's the first person who really wrote extensively on this, and it's a good start, but it's just the beginning. I mean, there's a lot more that needs to be done in this area. Now, contemporary universities, the famous universities are Harvard, Stanford. I've thrown in JNU because JNU drives a lot of the narratives today. And one of the consequences of our colonial history is that in the media, in the universities, and so on, you know, nowadays, Hindus are constantly portrayed as the problem, as the aggressors in contemporary discourse. You know, the Article 370 abrogation, now Ayodhya's, the grant of the land to Hindus, everything is going to get rolled into, you know, we have a huge problem here because the Hindus are claiming something. Now, alongside, there's been a massive distortion in cognitive dissonance. I've used the term epistemic violence briefly here, but there is a tremendous distortion in our own self-understanding of the Hindu worldview, the Hindu history, Hindu cosmology, Hindu philosophy, etc. And contemporary Hindu community worldwide is not in control over its own story and narrative. Okay. Now, if you look at the economic collapse of India, the data is coming from Angus Madison, who wrote a book called World Economy Historical Statistics for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, published in 2004. The data is pulled from that book. Now here is the more recent estimate. Utsa Patnaik and Prabhat Patnaik are a couple of professors who just published the estimate, $45 trillion taken out of the Indian economy during British rule of India. So through a book called A Theory of Imperialism, published by the Columbia University Press as recently as 2017. Okay. Now, I want to talk now about the colonial construction of knowledge. Okay. So this is a quotation from James Mill, and Kundan has researched James Mill extensively. So I want to sort of turn over to Kundan this question on what is the colonial construction of knowledge and how has it impacted Hindu society? Over to you, Kundan.
Thank you, Kalyan. I was just wondering if you could stop sharing the screen. We can come back to the screen later after I finish.
Okay.
So, thank you. So, in contemporary studies at this point in time, what you find is that a lot of research has been done on the economic impact of British colonization. You have the latest book by the Patnaiks, and you see this estimate being spoken about. Incidentally, there's a long history, of such kind of research. It began with The Drain of Wealth by Dadabhai Naoroji in mid 1800s. So there's a long history of that. Now, this is something, which has been done over a period of time, but what has not been done, in terms of the Hindu civilization and the Indian civilization is the effect of representation that happened on India. Colonialism is an unnatural situation. It's not a natural situation. And one of the thinkers, in the field, Gramsci basically says that colonization is a process which requires force and consent. So you basically need consent on the part of the colonizing people as well as the people who have been colonized. If the consent is not there, then colonization as a process is not going to happen. Which basically means that a certain kind of representation has to be produced. And that representation has to be internalized by the colonizers in order to exert the colonizing mission, and by the colonized who can succumb to the process of colonization by giving their consent, thinking that this is a process which is actually for their own good. And this was the process which was unleashed on India in early 1800s. And one of the chief protagonists, of this exercise was this gentleman by the name of James Mill. He was an employee of East India Company. He was hired somewhere around 1805, 1806, and he was financed for the next 10 years to basically produce a book on India titled History of British India. This book was published in 1817. It came in 3 volumes. And in the first volume, he has written 7 chapters on Hindus and Hinduism. I like to say that you will be hard pressed to find one single positive representation on Hindu and Hinduism in this entire book. What was the objective of James Mill? The objective of James Mill was to show how Hindus are uncivilized and savage people. Of course, he's not talking about the need of civilizing them at this point in time. That is not an explicit agenda. But what is very clear is to show how Hindus are uncivilized, brute, uncouth, savage, and so on and so forth. And in order to do that, what he does is that he shows the tradition, the society, as hierarchical and oppressive. And he uses various means to show hierarchy and oppression within the Hindu world. For instance, he will pick up the position of women, or he would pick up the ancient modes of Indian governance, where he would show by selective quotations that the Indian monarchy was basically suppressing the people, and it was exerting its brute force and power on them. So you already have, one quote which Kalyan has shared. I want to share another quote, just to give you a glimpse of what he was doing. This is about position of women. He says, the condition of the women is one of the most remarkable circumstances in the manners of nations. Among rude people, the women are generally degraded. Among civilized people, they are exalted. In the barbarian, the passion of sex is a brutal impulse, which infuses no tenderness, and his undisciplined nature leads him to abuse his power over every creature that is weaker than himself. The history of uncultivated nations uniformly represents the women as in a state of abject slavery from which they slowly emerge as civilization advances. In such a state of society, property is an advantage which it may naturally be supposed that the degraded sex are by no means permitted to enjoy. Being condemned to severe and perpetual labor, they are themselves regarded as useful property. And he goes on, and he talks about this. So, I just gave you a glimpse of what he has written in the position of women. Now, when you do an objective analysis of what the position of women has been in the society, what you find is that there were certain sages, women sages, who put together certain hymns of the Vedas. They were the ones who were the creators of certain hymns in the Vedas. We can safely say that they were participating in the creation of something which is held most sacred by the Hindus. When you look at Arthashastra, you also find that women held property. And there was this concept of Stridhan, which has been emphasized right from the very, very beginning of the Indian society, over which only the women had exclusive right. And this property was quite significant. But I'm not going to go into those details. What I'm saying through this example is that this narrative, which was unfolded in a particular context, hasn't really disappeared. It continues even today. You look at the textbooks of children here in the United States. When they talk about Hinduism, India, and Hindus, you will find that they continue to reproduce the same narrative. But of course, this narrative within these textbooks is not framed within the context of uncivilization and savagery. What is done is that it is done in politically correct ways. So I was just giving you an example to show that there was a particular misrepresentation with a particular intent which was unleashed on the Hindu civilization. And once the juggernaut got rolling, it hasn't really stopped. It continues in nuanced and sophisticated ways in contemporary academia, even today. I just gave you this example to keep the matters very simple. It is far more complex and complicated than that.
Okay. Shall I continue, Kundar?
Please.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to take you through a couple of quotations here, okay? So this is another quotation from James Mill. In truth, the Hindu, like the eunuch, excels in the qualities of a slave, dissembling, treacherous, mendacious, to an excess which surpasses even the usual measure of uncultivated society. In the highest degree conceited of themselves and full of affected contempt for others, in physical sense, disgustingly unclean in their persons and houses. And the important thing is, this was considered authoritative knowledge about the Hindus in that era, and it made it into the standard textbooks which were used to train the British officers who came into India. And subsequently, it got, in some ways, canonized into indisputable, uncontestable knowledge about the Hindu world. So here are a couple of more quotations. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip these. It's a Karl Marx quotation and a Max Muller quotation. Okay. And my idea was to show you how these narratives continue today. Here are a couple more. This is Sheldon Pollock and Romila Thapar. It's very Columbia. Sheldon Pollock, he says in an article he wrote in 2001, Sultan Zainul Abdin, who had heard about her, Sharada Devi's miraculous presence in the temple, had hopes of witnessing an epiphany. He came as the pious devotee he was and begged to have some vision of the goddess in his sleep. Sharada, however, gave no sign of presence. Indeed, far from granting the Sultan darshan, the goddess made him smash to pieces her own very own image. It's a very clever piece of writing, right? So what is he doing? He's doing two things, or maybe three things. First of all, he's completely burying the extraordinary fury of Islamic rulers towards Hindu temples, which resulted in anywhere from 3,000 to 50,000 temples, or maybe even more, 500,000 temples being destroyed in India. And we know we haven't yet made an adequate estimate of the number of temples destroyed, but the evidence of this Islamic destruction of temples is all over India. So he's burying that. Second, he's presenting Sultan Zainul Abidin as a pious devotee. It takes a great sleight of hand to transform the fury of the Islamic ruler into a pious devotion towards Sharda. Then, of course, he's doing a third thing, which is Sharda Devi made him smash to pieces her very own image. It's not his fault, really. It was her fault that he was made to smash her image to pieces. Okay, very clever, sophisticated, representation. It buries the truth and erects a falsehood. And this is what is going on in Columbia University, where they are producing supposedly new kinds of knowledge about the Hindu world. Let's take a look at the bottom quotation. So today, as you all know, the Supreme Court of India delivered a verdict on Ayodhya, unequivocally accepting the findings of the Archaeological Survey of India, which said that there was not just a temple under the Babri Masjid there, but there were multiple temples, in fact, and they had, which had been destroyed multiple times. They were rebuilt and destroyed again, and then the masjid was built on top of it. But here she is, Romila Thapar, eminent historian from Jawaharlal Nehru University, saying in the name of Hindu nationalism, it was destroyed. And they claimed it was a sacred site sacred to them, marking a temple to Rama, even though the excavations of the Archaeological Survey of India and its readings have been strongly disputed by other archaeologists and historians. So what is she doing? She's sowing a seed of doubt. Yes, the Archaeological Survey of India is saying that, but there are other archaeologists and historians who don't agree. So it's disputed. It's not an uncontestable fact. So this is an example of colonial era prejudice continuing in contemporary academic world and academic discourse. Let's move on. There is a slow awakening in the academia. This is Professor Balu. I'm going to skip this quotation where he's talking about the fact that the colonial era knowledge has become received knowledge now, almost uncontestable received knowledge that transforms India into an inferior and backward culture, essentially Hindus basically, in comparison to Western culture. And that is axiomatic in all of the study of the Hindu world today. Now, post-colonial theory. There is a discipline called post-colonial theory that has emerged, and here are some of the key people who sort of set in motion this field of study. And I'm going to again invite Kundan to say a few words about each of these people and how they have shaped this field. Over to you, Kundan.
Thank you, Kalyan. May I have the screen back, please?
Yeah.
So, this distorted misrepresentation, which was unleashed on India and other colonized nations, was contested. The contestation started right from the very beginning. You have some people in India who contested that representation. Predominant among them was Gandhiji himself. We are not going to go into those details, but I just wanted to emphasize this point, that it was not that the colonized people did not contest these representations. They contested the representations right from the very beginning. In the larger world of erstwhile colonized nations, there were certain thinkers, who started doing this in a very comprehensive manner, in a very systematic manner. Primary among them was this gentleman by the name of Aimé Césaire, from the Caribbeans, actually. We have a lot of participation from the Caribbeans today, and he was from Martinique. And he wrote this very wonderful book titled Discourse on Colonialism. And in that particular book, he's talking about the sociological as well as the psychological impact of colonialism. See, what happens is that when a particular stream of thought gets generated, it is not that it remains just in the university. In fact, the colonizers never intended for these thoughts to remain in universities alone. It was not coming from sheer pursuit of knowledge. There was an agenda behind it. And when there was an agenda, then it is very natural to think that that agenda will have its impact on the material world, on the sociological world, on the world in which governance was involved. And what happens is that when you internalize this discourse, or when you are subjected to a particular discourse, the internalization of that discourse begins to happen through osmosis. It's something like learning a language. When you are growing up, nobody teaches you the language, right? You pick up the language from being around within that context. A child learns the language through osmosis. And this is exactly what happens, with the colonized people. They grow up with a particular narrative, and that narrative gets internalized by them, leading to certain psychological impact. Chief among them being inferiority. And one is not aware of this. So Mrs. Sayre, very briefly, he spoke about both these things. There were two people who picked up on his work. One was Albert Memmi, who wrote this very influential book called The Colonizer and the Colonized. What he did was that he put the colonizer and the colonized in a dialectical relationship, in a binary. So what he's predominantly is saying in that book is that for the colonizer to elevate himself or herself, the degradation and depletion of the colonized is extremely important, which he does in many different ways. Now let me take you back, to the quotation from James Mill. Now, in order for the Britishers, to show themselves as civilized and superior, the Indians had to be degraded. The Indians had to be degraded in as many different ways as possible. So this whole idea of this dialectic, that Albert Memmi talks about, he unfolds in his book titled, The Colonizer and the Colonized. His analysis, we can safely say, is sociological in nature. Then there was another individual by the name of Frantz Fanon, who has written these two wonderful books, titled Black Skin, White Mask and The Wretched of the Earth. In these two books, he is basically going into the psychological impact of colonialism. And through that, he is essentially saying that colonization is a brutal process psychologically, and even when political decolonization is accomplished, true decolonization can only happen when the mind has been decolonized. So what he is suggesting is that we need to look into various ways in the discourse, in the manner in which the discourse has been analyzed, has been internalized, in order to really complete the decolonization process. Then there was another significant thinker, by the name of Michel Foucault, who talks about the intersection of power and knowledge. What he says is that there's always a power component to knowledge production. And it is basically the people who are in power who generate what can be considered as the eternalities of knowledge. But this knowledge which is being generated, it is not context independent. It is not timeless, as it is understood within the larger academic world. It is very much context dependent, which has a sociological basis embedded in contours of power that are operational on that society, which basically means that that people who are holding the power are also involved in the generation of that knowledge. I won't go into a lot of details, but this is something which he essentially spoke about. In 1978, there was the emergence of another thinker by the name of Edward Said. And in fact, in the contemporary world today, in the contemporary academic world, Said and post-colonialism have almost become synonymous. So what Said does is that he picks up, the writings of Albert Memmi, incidentally, in my understanding, without acknowledgement, and brings along this worldview which was unfolded by Michel Foucault in a very big way, and writes this highly influential book called Orientalism. Orientalism has become one of the Bibles of post-colonial studies at this point in time. All these authors and a couple of others, they basically give us a framework for analyzing the intellectual, the literary, the representational materials which were unleashed on the colonized. And this is, and their writings basically constitute the theoretical component of what is known as post-colonial studies. So over to you, Kalyan.
Okay, very good. Great, thank you. So let me continue. I'm going to share my screen again. So here are the key figures in post-colonial theory who have developed a lot of material and content which can be very useful. Now, in Hindu University of America, we are launching an area of study called Post-Colonial Hindu Studies. So I just want to give you a quick overview of the different areas of study available at Hindu University of America. Hindu Studies Foundations, Sanskrit Studies, Texts and Traditions, Yoga Studies, Post-Colonial Hindu Studies, History and Method, and Conflict and Peace. Okay, and we're going to talk about Post-Colonial Hindu Studies. So, Post-Colonial Hindu Studies consists of a collection of courses. Right now we have 6 courses put together. Kundar, I'll turn it over to you again to explain these courses very briefly as we are running out of time. Okay.
Sure. So, so before I talk about these courses, I just briefly want to mention that what we are finding is that even when the field of post-colonial studies exists, the narrative which was unleashed on the Hindus are not really critically examined in the field. And this is, this has come out from from a lot of investigation that we have done. And that's why we decided that we are going to create this field, titled Post-Colonial Hindu Studies, which is actually unique in the world. There is nowhere, where you will find a discipline by the name of Post-Colonial Hindu Studies. And the idea is that we are going to go about this in a very systematic manner. So let me, come to the first course, which is critical issues in Hindu studies. So what are we going to do here? In this particular course, we are going to take the writings, the original writings of two critical thinkers, who have situated the world of Hindu studies in the academic discipline in contemporary times. James Mill, we are going to read all the 7 chapters that James Mill has written on Hindus and critically examine them. There was another book which was published around the same time in 1817, titled Hindu Customs and Manners. And this book was written by a French Catholic priest or missionary in India by the name of Abbé Dubois. He, of course, wrote that book in French, but understanding its value for the imperialistic purposes, what East India Company did was that it bought the manuscript and it translated that manuscript into English. So these are 2 books that we are going to systematically study. And through our reading of these texts, we are basically going to make explicit the various motivations that they had in unfolding a particular representation on the Hindu people. In the second course, Anti-Colonialism and Post-Colonialism, we are going to engage ourselves in the process of theory building. And in this particular course, we are going to study in great detail some of the thinkers that I spoke about. Aimé Césaire, Albert Memmi, Frantz Fanon, a little bit of Foucault, maybe. I don't think we'll have time, to get into the writings of Edward Said, which I have reserved, for the next course, Orientalism and Hinduism. So in this particular course, what we will do is that we will go into the framework developed by Edward Said and see how that framework can actually be applied for deconstructing the field of Hindu studies. We will then proceed, to the philosophical foundations of Orientalism, and here, we are going to study in detail the influences on Edward Said. We'll go into the writings of Gramsci, Louis Althusser, and Michel Foucault. We might go into a little bit of Nietzsche as well, because Nietzsche had profoundly influenced Michel Foucault in the creation of his thoughts. We will then come to philosophy of science and Hinduism. In today's contemporary discourse, there's a lot of dialogue and debate, whether Hinduism is science or not, whether Hinduism is religion. The entire field basically gets constructed within the binary of religion and science. So what we have decided is that we would look into the philosophy of science in great detail. We'll look into some of the well-known philosophers of science like Thomas Kuhn, Paul Feyerabend, Imre Lakatos, and Karl Popper. And by looking at their contentions and philosophies, we are basically going to analyze, whether Hinduism is science or not. What are the similarities and dissimilarities or differences that Hinduism shares with the manner in which science is understood in the contemporary world. And then, we'll finally come to this course titled Contesting Neo-Hinduism. In contemporary academia, what you find is that people are making this claim that there are two kinds of Hinduism, traditional Hinduism and Neo-Hinduism. And there's a significant break between traditional Hinduism and Neo-Hinduism. And Neo-Hinduism is basically a response of the Indian thinkers against what the colonizers and missionaries were writing on Hinduism. So we are basically going to critically examine this binary divide which has been transposed on scholarship on Hinduism. That is going to be our central focus. So these are the 6 courses that we have created, for colonial Hindu studies at this point in time. And as time goes by, we are going to create more and more courses because, as we mentioned earlier, this field of studies is still in the state of infancy, and a lot needs to be done if we really want to claim our ownership of the ways in which we have been historically. So having said that, Kalyan, over to you.
Yeah, okay, good. All right, very good. So now, let's move on. So of course, we want everybody wants to write rebuttals and immediately get in the news media. And, obviously we live in the era of that is driven by news media, right? And social media, news media, putting together small videos, and we want to get into knowledge distribution. But I think first we need to prepare ourselves. We've got to get into some systematic and rigorous study so that we can frame these issues appropriately. Okay, so now I want to suggest to you that we have put together a 1 credit hour course called Orientation to Hindu Studies, which is a starting point for this whole sequence. It involves 10 hours of classes, 20 hours of self-study for a total of about 30 hours of work spread over approximately somewhere between 10 to 12 weeks. And it will provide an overview of all the programs, areas of study, and sample courses. We do lots of readings, look at papers, we watch videos, we'll get grounded in certain Sanskrit words and phrases, and it'll be taught by a group of faculty. Okay, multiple people will conduct different sessions. And I think this would be a very good entry point into the curriculum being offered by Hindu University of America. The cost of the course is $300 for a 1 credit hour course if you register before December 1st, and $325 after December 1st. Everything will be done online, just like we're doing this webinar. And you can participate in the continuing education program or register to the certificate program in Post-Colonial Hindu Studies, or you can even register into a graduate program, a master's degree or a doctoral degree. So there's a whole curriculum. So we invite you to go and take a look at the curriculum and possibilities on our website. So this particular course will take place over a 60-minute class on Thursday evenings from 8 to 9 p.m. Central Time, 9 p.m. Coast time, and 6 p.m. Pacific. And there'll be papers to read and some videos to watch and some short essays to write as well. Okay, it's a very good way of getting your feet wet or sticking your toe into the waters of Hindu studies in a contemporary framework. These are the 10, 11 sessions. We look at the Hindu studies background, we look at colonialism and its aftermath in depth, building blocks of Hindu thought, the academic architecture and foundations of Hindu studies, Sanskrit studies, deep immersion into the Sanskrit world, texts and traditions. We look at 1 or 2 texts, Post-Colonial Hindu Studies, history and method, conflict and peace, and future direction pathways. So this will be the overall structure of that first course. These are the outcomes we expect from the course. You'll get to explore various options of trajectories, distinguish central ideas and concepts, inquire into and evaluate different elective areas, distinguish between different pathways, going deep into study of Hindu thought or towards deep engagement with Western thought. And we have to discover and create pathways for engagement with the Hindu studies curricula for yourself. Okay, so this is what we anticipate what these programs, this particular course will enable you to accomplish. This can be taken up by people who are culturally Hindu as well as people who are culturally non-Hindu. People who are looking to develop new skills and expertise, wish to participate in writing and speaking, just people curious about life and looking for direction. Non-Hindu people who are interested in Hindu thought and culture, yoga, New Age, spiritual communities. People who are engaged already in public service as teachers, doctors, counselors, therapists, and chaplains. And then academics and scholars who wish to acquire an authentic perspective of Hindu thought. All of these people can take this course. I'll give you the many courses of study that are available. Well, why should you engage? So if you want to go beyond basic knowledge, some basic understanding of worship and practice, some spiritual advancement and personal transformation, if you want to go into writing and articulation, engage more with the media and the public square, get into advocacy and policy, become a participant in debates and dialogues, be someone who can represent Hindu Dharma, defend it and contest erroneous ideas about Hindu Dharma, conflict resolution, generally take ownership of the narrative, you need to engage with some form of academic study, and that is what we are hoping to accomplish with this program. And lastly, future possibilities as you engage with the knowledge, skills, and transformation that's available in our curriculum. There are many, many possibilities that we hope will emerge for you. Okay, and you can create second careers, supplementary opportunities for yourself, etc. So I'm going to stop on that note and acknowledge that we are 2 minutes past the hour. We're willing to take a few questions if you are up to staying for a few more minutes. So let us see if there are any important questions we haven't addressed. Please type your question in and we can have a quick discussion. Sanskrit for AI, okay. So you have to understand Vyakarana, the grammar, the Sanskrit grammar, the Ashtadhyayi of Panini. And then what you will find is you will discover the way Sanskrit functions as a meta language, and why it is uniquely suited for artificial intelligence and language translations and so on. So at Hindu University of America, we're not currently committed to teaching Sanskrit for artificial intelligence per se, but we do have courses that can take you deep into the grammar, the Ashtadhyayi, the Mahabhashya, etc. Any other questions? Yeah, Sanskrit for AI will be interesting, naturally. Any other questions? Yeah, why should we read about Westerners' views on Hinduism? Okay, that's a great question. Okay, very quickly, very short, in a very short answer, much of what you know today about Hinduism comes from two different sources. One that's been transmitted to us from our parents, our families, and culture, and so on. And another comes from Western interpretations and propositions about the Hindu world. Okay, and our self-understanding about Hinduism is mixed up. It's intermixed with two narratives, and we don't know what is what for the most part. Some things we think are true are in fact not true at all, and some things which we think are totally false are in fact true. So we haven't gone through a systematic process of decolonization of the Hindu mind. And one of the
So we lost Kalyan. Okay, maybe the connection is gone. So basically, I will take that question, or rather continue with the answer. Yeah, as Kalyan was saying that most of the things that we know today, particularly when we expose ourselves to English language, actually comes from people who have written on the Hindu tradition by largely not locating themselves within a particular framework. We like to call it as a paradigm. Because of which we are increasingly finding that the representations which we encounter in the current academia don't actually square with how the Hindus themselves conceptualize the world for them. We would want to understand and know that Hinduism was extremely literary in orientation. There are literally millions of manuscripts which were written by the ancestors of the Hindus. And there came a particular point in time in 1835 when the entire field of study was delegitimized by Macaulay, who was the representative of the British government in India. This basically led to a complete decimation of the field or the world in which the Hindus wrote, studied, and perpetuated the tradition, cosmology, and culture. And that is the reason, we need to study what has been written by the Westerners on Hinduism and Hindus. There are two simultaneous processes which are in operation, and I won't go into a lot of details, but academically, in order to resurrect the Hindu world, what we to do is basically deconstruct what is existent, which means that we need to critically examine the discourse which has been unfolded on Hinduism. And the idea is that if you do not sufficiently deconstruct, in many conscious and unconscious ways, you will end up reproducing the same discourse which was unleashed on us during the colonial period.
So then I'm back. Okay. Sorry, everybody. Sorry, my computer crashed. My phone off.
I took it up from there. So
yeah. Perfect. Very good. Thank you.
But I think we're largely done with that answer.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Any other questions? Anybody? Please type it in if you have one.
There's one more,
What is it?
take a look at the window and probably you'll be able to see it. Oh,
No, I think, Soumyaji, I saw your question. I mean, I don't think we are advocating destruction of temple, So it's a very funny Hindu attitude that accuses the fellow Hindus of somehow being very destructive. And that itself is a colonial byproduct. You know, uh, it seems that we are quicker to turn on each other and accuse each other of some hidden agendas much more quickly than we are willing to recognize and understand what really happened to the Hindu world. Okay, uh, and I think that's something we need to reflect on. In fact, one of the great difficulties the Hindu world has is its inability to internally create shared platforms, shared understandings, and shared initiatives. Uh, so there is a tremendous internal force that seems to dissipate and sort of like disintegrate and fragment the Hindu world very, very rapidly.
in fact, Kalyan, what I would like to say is that it is basically the internalization of the colonial narrative, of Hindus as violent people, which has been reproduced over and over again, because of which the moment we talk about the recovery of something which has been lost, something which was brutalized, then this whole projection of violence begins to come on the Hindu people. We may have nothing to do with an ideology which is called right within the Western world. But the moment you begin to talk about some of these legitimate concerns, which are legitimate, in the field of African American studies, let's say, for instance, or Native American studies, or gay and lesbian LBGT studies, or feminist studies, they are considered absolutely illegitimate, for the Hindu world and for the Hindus.
Right.
This is the power of misrepresentation, which has actually been unleashed on the Hindus. So all that we are concerned here is, is basically recovery of a lost paradigm, a lost framework, a lost cosmology, because of the process of colonization.
Okay, so where do we need Hinduism exactly? Well, if you think we don't need it, then there's no point. So I'm not going to answer that question, whether we need it or not. It's up to you, for you to come to some recognition on that front. And of course, one can live one's entire life not needing Hinduism at all. That's a legitimate place to be. But we are doing this because we think Hinduism has something to offer, not just for the Hindu people themselves, but also for the rest of the world, which seems always at the brink of extreme polarization and hostility. And Hinduism has something to say about coexistence, about plurality, about tolerance, about understanding, about how to live without having to demonize and denounce some other people. And on that note, I think Hinduism has something to say to the rest of the world as well. We'll leave it at that. On that point. Where? Okay, say more about Dharmaji. Say more about what do you mean by where? What is the where you're talking about? Is it location? Is it a space? What are you referencing? Location as in geographically. Yeah, I mean, I think, see, so there are two places. One is everywhere there are Hindus. Today, Hindu people are a global diaspora. Of course, the majority is in India, Nepal, etc. But there are Hindus everywhere today. Trinidad and Tobago, in Suriname, in Fiji, in Nepal, in Ceylon, in America, North America, in Canada, in Australia, and so on. So there is, insofar as there is the opportunity for Hindus to learn about themselves, their own culture, traditions, and civilization, there is a need for Hindu education. And of course, as far as the worldwide interest in Hindu civilization and culture, whether they come through the lens, the doorway, the window of yoga, or the window of Ayurveda, the window of meditation, spirituality, New Age, etc. There is a lot for those communities as well. So, where is, strictly speaking, everywhere where there is an interest in Hindu studies. Okay, I think we have exceeded our time by 15 minutes. And unless there is any other question, I'd like to conclude with an invitation to all of you. We, kindly consider participating in the courses and programs of study at HUA, and you can start by registering into the Orientation to Hindu Studies course. Okay, fantastic. And thank you all. Thank you for your time today and your patience. And yeah, so Divya, see, we can start in either place, okay? But I think there are two directions to move from, and each person will have to choose what is of unique interest to them. And but do get in touch with me if you are interested in further discussions on this topic. I'll be happy to be available. All right. So thank you very much, everybody. Namaste, and wonderful. Have a wonderful weekend.
Namaste, everyone.
Namaste. Namaste, everyone.